because I like kimchi, I like Koreans, and that isn't true.
And I want to thank you for being here, for your words and your wisdom. I want to say 수고했어요 to you for all your work and for guiding us to expand our moral imagination. I'm honored to get the chance to ask you questions, and we have a few audience questions I'll weave into our conversation.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me, EJ. It's really a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Ava DuVernay says, when speaking to the role of storytellers, we need to create a bridge between entertainment and education. Your trilogy, The Koreans, with Free Food for Millionaires, Pachinko, and forthcoming American Hagwon, reminds me of this role of storytellers. The more I read Pachinko, the more I thought about Free Food for Millionaires. I was thinking about Hansu and Ted, about Yangjin and Huni and Joseph and Leah. Each book seems a part of a larger web, and the reader's job to disentangle it. What is your vision for the Koreans? What are your hopes for the trilogy as a whole?
Oh gosh, what a great question. Thank you. I think that for me, my world is really connected. And because I have taken a great deal of energy of thinking about Korean people around the world and how much diaspora has affected all these other global Koreans, as well as Koreans on the peninsula. And of course, it's a divided nation. I guess my hope is to have people really think of us as human, as individuals, and not some sort of monolith, because Koreans are, I think, just as complicated as anybody else, except we have this very tragic history. So if anything, we have things more in common with other nations that have had tragic histories. And I want very much for people to get to know Koreans and give them a chance. And I know that sounds like a silly thing to say, but very often Koreans are so often dismissed as something simple. And I think that's really a shame. Very often we think about North Koreans rather than South Koreans. And there's so many South Koreans, actually there's double South Koreans. And as well as, Koreans in Brazil or Argentina or Peru. And I kind of think, we really need to sort of think bigger.
Right. Thank you. And I have an audience question for you. They ask, can you speak about the prejudices that play such a big role in Pachinko and how it reflects the current situation in Japan, Korea, and the United States? The follow-up is, given Japan's historically insular nature and its aging population, do you foresee more cultural acceptance of proposed immigration reform?
Very good question. I think that the way the Koreans are treated in Japan right now have obviously improved since before. However, it has not really improved in terms of social attitude. I think that they might say, oh, I really like K-pop or I like K-drama, but that's almost like saying I like President Obama and I like Oprah Winfrey, but I don't really like African Americans. I think that's my real connection, is that I think people think because I like kimchi, I like Koreans, and that isn't true. So that's very troubling to me, because you shouldn't be objectified or put into a celebrity status when the experience of ordinary Koreans is actually far more complicated and complex and actually really interesting. So I think that that's one of the things that I'd like to highlight. But to answer the question about how they're treated today, in my experience in all my interviews, things really haven't changed that much. I think that in terms of housing discrimination, job discrimination, there's a lot of tokenism that occurs. So if a company might hire one person, they might not hire many. The thing that I find really troubling among Koreans is self-hatred. I see that a lot because there's so much systemic racism, and therefore people start to swallow this information and actually say pretty horrible things about themselves and about each other. And I find that to be deeply troubling. And that requires honesty, and it requires education. And I don't know if that's really going to happen on a national basis. So I'm not very optimistic, actually. I'm really not. Sad, but I'm not.
A lot of work to do.
It's a lot of work for everybody to do. And I think what's really funny to me is that people tend to think of this as work and it's something that you don't want to do.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable. However, there's a lot of upside to ending racism and sexism and classism, because then you actually have a much better planet. You actually have more talented people in your team.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're constantly forgetting the upside rather than just thinking, oh, I don't want to change things. But things aren't that great now, so why not change?
That's wonderful. Thank you for that answer. This next one is, it might help us thinking about this as well, but your characters are so wide-ranging, which also makes each of them vividly personal. Would Casey Hahn from Free Food for Millionaires and Phoebe and Solomon from Pachinko get along? What would be the relationship dynamic in this broad spectrum of what it means to be Korean here by their own definition or reckoning?
I think that Korean Americans, modern Korean Americans, and certainly every generation is different. So right now I teach Generation Z, and Generation Z is very different than millennials, and millennials are incredibly different than Generation X, and X is really different from boomers. And it's so important that we recognize the generational differences. In the same way, I hear young Korean Americans say things like, well, you know, Korean American mothers are this way, or Korean dads are this way. And I kind of think that's really racist what you just said, because they're not a monolith. So that's a really good example of internalized racism, thinking, I know one isolated fact about one family and therefore I know everything. So that's something that I constantly work on. But generationally, would Solomon and Phoebe and Casey get along? Well, they would have far more in common. And I think that the other generations, however, I think Solomon's a really good person. And I think that in the novel, he's a very minor character. And that was intentional because he really couldn't carry a story or a novel at all. I tried that in my first draft and I dumped it because Solomon's actually kind of a good, insipid person. I interviewed him quite a lot. I interviewed people like him. And he's a Wall Street guy and he wants to be obedient and good. And he gets played. He gets played. He is not a bad person. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is how a person like Solomon operates in the world. And I found that I couldn't put him in the story. But I did realize that all that obedience, all that perfectionism, it comes from generations of being disliked. You're like, oh, how can I be better? And in that sense, Solomon and Noah actually have similarities because Solomon's trying to perfect something that Noah couldn't perfect.
Right.
So that's important. And I think Phoebe and Casey, gosh, like I love Casey so much because she, as a matter of fact, I think most people understand her better today in 2020 than when she came out in 2007, because in 2007, people thought she was very radical and kind of like a little bit too much of a troublemaker. Whereas young women right now are constantly saying to me, I get letters all the time, she's my Shiro and she's a badass. I'm thinking, well, in 2007, they thought, how could she walk away from a Wall Street job? That's crazy. Whereas now you're like, of course you should walk away from a Wall Street job. So that was really funny to me because I wanted to honor the independent spirit that young Korean American women have. I like that energy. I think they're interesting and fun and fashionable and cool. And that was not being celebrated in 2007. And I